The bank didn't send me a debt collector. They didn't send a man in a cheap suit to knock on my door with a folder full of threats and a cold, judgmental stare. They were much more elegant, much more sophisticated than that. They sent me a shimmering gold card, nestled inside a velvet-lined box, like a crown meant for a newly crowned king. At 22, I didn't feel like a borrower. I felt like I had been knighted into the ranks of the successful. A banker named Sarah, with a voice as sweet as expensive honey and a smile that seemed to say, "You belong here among the elite," called it a reward for my responsibility. I remember sitting in her office, a space that smelled of expensive citrus air freshener and rich, leather-bound binders. She didn't use the word debt. She talked about flexibility. She leaned in, her eyes reflecting the gold on the plastic, and talked about the vacations I deserved to experience, right now. Not in 10 years when I was old and tired, but today, while I still had the fire of youth in my veins. When I finally swiped that card for my first trip to Paris, I felt like royalty. I remember the taste of the bitter espresso by the Seine, and the way the orange city lights hit the wet cobblestones after a light rain. I was living the life I had always dreamed of, and I felt absolutely untouchable. But Sarah wasn't there to help me reach my potential. She was a shepherd, and I had just walked into the slaughterhouse with a confident smile on my face and a first-class boarding pass in my hand. I soon discovered that the real execution didn't happen under the romantic lights of the Eiffel Tower. It happened months later, in the cold blue light of my laptop screen, staring at my monthly statements. The bank introduced me to a brilliant psychological snare called the minimum payment. They made it look so small, so manageable, almost like an act of mercy for a young guy just starting his career. But it wasn't mercy. It was a mathematical trap designed to keep me in a state of perpetual debt. They lent me the money at a staggering 24% interest rate. In the moment of the swipe, it was just an abstract number on a screen. But there is a dark law of finance they never teach you in school. A law that turns the passage of time into a weapon used against you. The rule of 72. If you divide 72 by your interest rate, you find out exactly how long it takes for your debt to double on its own. For me, 72 divided by 24 equaled 3. Every 3 years, my debt would double without me ever buying a single new thing. Sarah didn't tell me that 90% of my manageable monthly payment was just to feed the insatiable hunger of the interest. She didn't tell me that while I was paying for my flexibility, the principal was sitting there, heavy, cold, and immovable as a granite tombstone. They tossed me points and cash back like breadcrumbs to a pigeon, just enough to keep me distracted and cooing while I stayed locked in the cage. I was actually feeling smart for getting 1% back on a debt that was charging me 24%. It was the ultimate con. 5 years later, the memories of Paris had faded into grainy, forgotten photos on my phone. But the plastic in my wallet was still very much alive, and it was getting heavier with every passing day. It burned in my pocket every time I walked past a store. It felt like a physical weight, a parasite that grew heavier every time I tried to ignore its existence. I remember the paralyzing shame of standing at a checkout line, my palms sweating, praying the approved message would pop up before the person behind me grew impatient. I had paid a total of $15,000 for an original debt of only $5,000. I wasn't a customer to them. I was a securitized asset. To Sarah and her board of directors, I was nothing more than a steady stream of passive income, a high-yield bond the bank used to enrich their shareholders at the cost of my sanity and my future. I watched Leo at the office pay for lunch with crisp physical cash. I used to think he was outdated, like he was missing out on the rewards and the status of the system. Now, I realize he was the only one who was truly free. Leo owned his present moment. He could walk into the grocery store and buy a gallon of milk without paying interest on it for the next 5 years. I, on the other hand, had already sold my entire future for a weekend of croissants and a piece of gold-colored plastic. Every morning, I'd wake up and check my banking app before I even swung my legs out of bed. It was a ritual of pure dread. I stayed in a job where my boss made me feel small, where the commute was 2 hours of soul-crushing traffic because I was terrified of a late fee notification. The system doesn't need you to collapse. A total failure can't pay interest. They need you functioning, but completely broke. They need you healthy enough to show up to your cubicle, but desperate enough to keep swiping just to feel a fleeting moment of relief. I bought a card to open up the world. I thought I was buying freedom. But for 10 years, that card made sure I never stepped foot out of the office. It turned my dreams into a monthly subscription I could never afford to cancel. I was a king in a velvet crown, but I realized too late that the crown was made of lead and bolted to my head. Most people never see the cage until they're already locked inside, polishing their gold card as if it's a medal of honor rather than a mark of servitude. And by the time they realize that they aren't the VIP, it's already too late.